Jesse here from Matt Naps, and today we're going to be talking about the Logan Paul versus Floyd Mayweather fight and a possible Khabib versus GSP matchup. So starting with Mayweather versus Paul, they just had the press conference today. For those of you who didn't see it, kind of a shit show, pretty bland for the most part. Couple of good jabs by both guys verbally, and then Jake obviously ended up taking Floyd's hat. Looked like at the end there he was crying, but I couldn't tell if he was faking it and just being playing around, being a fucking idiot, or if he was actually crying. Either way, I'm not too. The crying is kind of if it was actually crying, that kind of looks bad. But the fact that he was covering his face, he possibly got a black eye. I'm not too. A lot of people are like, "Oh, Jake's a bitch, Jake's a bitch, Jake's a bitch," and it's like you got jumped by 6 guys twice his size. I'm not sure who you think would win that fight. But that being said, the crying part was kind of funny, but especially if it was actual crying and not just fucking around, playing around. But definitely an interesting video to watch if you haven't seen it yet. I wish they had a better angle on it because you can't really see what's going on because all those guys jump on him. Logan ends up jumping in, breaking it up for the most part. And then, Jake runs away, and then you see him again. Yeah, he's covering his face. Looks like he's crying, but you can't, I can't tell if he's fake crying, joking around, or if it's real crying. It's hard to tell. But yeah, so with the Mayweather versus Paul fight, now there's a couple of things that are interesting with this fight. Firstly, everyone seems to forget the massive size difference. Floyd is a guy who has fought most of his career around 145 pounds. Logan is above 200 pounds normally. I think for this fight specifically, he has to weigh in at 190 pounds. But that is still a 45-pound weight advantage. And I don't people seem to forget that that's a big weight advantage. Now, of course, skill-wise, Floyd is years and years ahead of him. You're talking about a guy that's been boxing pretty much since he could walk, fighting a guy that's been boxing for 3 years. So there is definitely a skill level. But the big thing is Paul is a much, much bigger guy. He's a decent athlete. He's not some unathletic slob. And the youth factor, because Floyd keeps getting older, right? And eventually Father Time catches up to everyone. And one of these days, Floyd is going to show up and be a lot slower than he was before. And, it might be against Paul. So that'll be interesting. Even if Paul beats Mayweather, I don't think that says much, just because you're talking about if he beats him, he's not going to outbox him. He's just going to land a clean shot and put Floyd down because of the size difference and the strength difference and all of that. And I don't think it'll say much about either fighter. One, because Floyd's into his 40s now, and he's fighting a guy that's literally almost fucking 50% bigger than him, right? This guy is damn near another half of Floyd on top of Floyd. So there's even if Floyd loses, I don't think it really says anything about Floyd's career. I think he's still one of, if not the greatest boxers of all time. And if Paul wins, I don't think it says much about him either. Obviously it'll bring him a lot of hype, but from an actual boxing perspective, I mean, it's not really that impressive to take away the name Mayweather. The fact that you're beating up a guy in his mid-40s that's half your size isn't really that impressive when you're, a 25-year-old athletic kid. That being said, Floyd will probably outbox him, outwork him if he's able to not get hit, which he's been able to do against top level boxers, guys that are lighter and much faster than Logan. Sorry. The big thing will be I don't think he's ever fought somebody with Logan's reach. He might have. There are some tall guys in that division, some tall, lanky guys. But he's definitely never fought anyone with the kind of strength to muscle him around that Logan has. That being said, I don't know how much this will end up in the clinch. Logan was a decent wrestler, not a high level wrestler, but he did wrestle. So if he's smart, he will get it in the clinch and try and wear him down. But the thing is, the problem with that is the best places for Logan are in the clinch and out at range, right? Because he's got the reach advantage, so he wants to be out long, and he's got the wrestling advantage, so he wants to be in the clinch. But the thing is, one, you don't know how much the referee's going to allow the clinch. Probably not very much. And two is even if he does keep him at range, there's always the fact that Floyd slips much, much high level boxers punches all the time. It's really hard for guys that are, been boxing since they were 4 or 5 years old, that are at the world class level guys that are much faster than the Paul brothers. Smaller, quicker guys. It's much more difficult for them to hit Floyd. So I just don't see. It'll be interesting, but I don't see Paul winning. I think Floyd's probably going to win. But if Paul did win, that would be absolutely hilarious. And then obviously the other fight that we're going to talk about is the Khabib versus GSP fight. So both guys have said over the last little bit this is pretty much the only fight that they are going to take. I don't know if the UFC will do it. I imagine, I don't really see why they wouldn't do it, just because it's a big one-off show for them. Both guys said that they just want to do it right off into the sunset. They don't care if it's for a belt. They don't care about any of that. Khabib wants to retire 30-0. GSP wants to be the pound-for-pound greatest ever, which, in my opinion, it's either him or Jones. Jones has more title wins and has no losses if you don't include the DQ. But there's always that asterisk, especially for people that really, really don't like PEDs. They will. So it's either GSP or Jones, in my opinion. And then Khabib is obviously the greatest light heavyweight of all time, or not light heavyweight, sorry, lightweight of all time. So for GSP is into that challenge. That being said, these guys are both very interesting stylistic matchups for each other. Khabib, they're basically problems for each other, and the reason I say that is because Khabib's striking is not the crispest, right? He's not known for his crisp striking, right? He puts a ridiculous amount of pressure on guys to the point where they're just terrified of those takedowns and they won't strike, and he can just throw whatever he wants. So while he does have knockdowns, like he got the knockdown on Conor, he caught Conor a couple times. A lot of that is because those guys are afraid of his wrestling, right? They're afraid to counter because they think the second they counter, Khabib's just going to dive on that leg. And for good reason, a lot of the time that's true. I think the big difference is with GSP is that GSP is the bigger fighter. He's an inch or two taller. I think Khabib's 5'9", GSP's 5'10" or 5'11". Khabib might be 5'10". I'm not 100% positive on that. But I think GSP is roughly an inch taller. He's got a 2 to 3 inch reach advantage. He's the much more faster, explosive athlete. Khabib, and that's another thing, is that they're both known for their wrestling, but they have very different styles of wrestling. GSP is much more just blast doubles. He times it really well. If you watch interviews with him, he says it's from his karate, which would make sense. And he basically whenever somebody goes to throw a punch, he'll just duck under, and he's so explosive that it'll take them down. Khabib, on the other hand, isn't as explosive. He's got more of that static strength, and he just chain wrestles guys and just puts so much pressure on them that they can't stop the chain wrestling. So in one way, Khabib is a much better pure wrestler from a technical standpoint, but GSP is the more explosive athlete with the better timing and also the bigger guy. I think the biggest problem for Khabib is that if GSP is able to circle away from him and not let him get the takedowns, and if GSP is able to duck under Khabib's punches and put him down, especially with the size difference, he might be able to do that. We have seen Khabib getting taken down before by Abel Trujillo, although he then went on to break the UFC record for takedowns against Abel, as retribution for that takedown. So it'll be interesting. Maybe if GSP takes Khabib down, Khabib gets super aggressive with the wrestling, possibly over aggressive, and then GSP can just jack him up. And the other thing is that GSP is historically been a guy where when he gets a lot of pressure on him, if you look at all the times he's made mistakes, which is very, very rare, but the Hughes fight and the Sarah fight, when you put a lot of pressure on him, you can make him wilt. The problem is it is very, very hard to put that pressure on him, because he's both so much more explosive than everyone, has so much better cardio than everyone, and he has much, much more better use of range, and he did have a reach advantage. He has really long arms for his division. I think at the time he had a 2 or 3 inch reach advantage on everyone. So he had a similar advantage to John Jones and Conor McGregor and those guys. but obviously used his wrestling much more than Conor did. Jones, again, was another guy that used wrestling, so that seems to be the big factor is if you get these guys with that long reach, they're able to use that striking, and then they're able to if they either grow up wrestling or, in GSP's case, learn wrestling, then they become a very big problem to deal with. Khabib, on the other hand, has a much more normal-sized reach for his height, and again, him being the smaller guy, that gives GSP a decent-sized reach advantage, a 3 or 4 inch reach advantage, which could be a big factor. I think all in all, the size is probably going to be the biggest thing. I think if you look at the way they fight, Khabib definitely has a really good chance if he can put that pressure on GSP. If he can, especially if he can hurt him early, and put him down, then he has a really good chance. But I think it'll be difficult for Khabib being the smaller guy, being probably the slower guy. Even though he is smaller, he'll probably still be the slower guy. GSP is known for being. I can't even think of a welterweight as fast as him, right? Like, he was just, nobody could stop his jab, his Superman punch, his takedowns, right? He was just too fast for everyone. And even the guys that moved up from welterweight or from lightweight, who he fought, like BJ Penn. BJ Penn was known for being a fast lightweight, right? He was faster than most of the lightweights in his day, back when he was in his prime. And GSP was still too fast to him for a degree. BJ Penn had a better reaction time, I would say, and GSP's even talked about this himself. He had a guy that came in and broke down, frame by frame, all these different guys in the UFC, and said that BJ Penn had the fastest reaction time. But in terms of explosivity and speed, GSP always seemed to be a step ahead of him, right? So like while BJ could react quicker, once St. Pierre had reacted, the result would be quicker, if you understand what I mean. So BJ had basically the faster nervous system, but GSP had the faster muscle twitch fibers. And it seems to be that way at pretty much everyone he fights. And I can't even really think of a guy at 55 that is faster than St. Pierre. If you think about the top guys, maybe Frankie Edgar, when Frankie was in his prime, Frankie was pretty damn fast, and part of that was because he was, probably a natural bantamweight. He has fought as low as bantamweight, but yeah, I think a big thing is that St. Pierre is probably just too big, too fast. But again, Khabib's technical wrestling, and the thing is, Khabib's good off his back too. If St. Pierre puts him down, it's not like Khabib's gonna go away. He's got triangles before. The Justin Gaethje fight, a couple of submission jiu-jitsu and sambo matches. He's got subs in, a lot of them, because obviously jiu-jitsu is mostly sub only for the most part, unless you do combat jiu-jitsu. So yeah, all in all, I think interesting fight. The greatest welterweight of all time versus the greatest lightweight of all time. Two guys who a lot of people think are in that conversation for the greatest of all time. I don't know if I'd put Khabib quite there in terms of pound for pound, just because there's so many people that have more accomplishments than him. I think it really depends on what you mean by greatest of all time too, because some people think it's who at their peak, right? So technically you could either never win a championship or just win the title and then lose. But if you had a very high peak, some people consider that the most impressive, and then other people consider longevity and the ability to have a long title reign as the top, right? So a good example of this is Chuck Liddell versus Tito Ortiz. So if you look at their peaks, Chuck probably had the higher peak. He was the better guy when they were both in their primes. They both fought twice in their prime, and Chuck won both fights by knockout. But if you look at the entirety of the career, Tito had one more title defense, and then Tito afterwards was able to have a much longer, more successful career. He did have a bad streak at the end of the UFC, but then after he went to Bellator, he's won most of his fights against a lot of top-level guys, pretty much the best guys outside the UFC, and he was able to avenge that loss to Chuck. So if you're one of those people that considers it how high they were able to peak in their prime, Chuck Liddell is clearly the better fighter. But if you're one of those people that view it as list of accomplishments, then Tito is the better fighter. So it really depends on how you view the GOAT. But for me, it's kind of a mix of both those things, right? Like I don't think you can go on potential, right? Like this guy had the potential to break records. I don't think you can go on that because you could make that same argument for somebody that's literally never fought, right? You could say LeBron James is the GOAT of MMA because, he had the athletic potential. Imagine if he started training when he was 5 years old and took this seriously. And that's kind of my problem with those arguments that go against accomplishments is they can be made for literally anyone, even guys that have never fought, right? It's when you take it to its logical conclusion, it doesn't make sense. So I think accomplishments are everything, right? Especially because you can only compare guys to their own era. In a sport like MMA, a guy like like Hickson Gracie or a Fedor or even the top UFC fighters at the time like Mark Coleman or fucking Maurice Smith. Maurice Smith probably being the best example. Had they had access to better training, better technology, and all that stuff, they probably would have been able to compete at the same level today. Like Maurice Smith is a guy who got his ass kicked most of his first fights because he was basically just a kickboxer, and in the early days, strikers that didn't know any takedown defense were getting their fucking asses beat because, anyone that knew a takedown would just take them down and then they were completely useless, right? But then once Maurice Smith learned takedown defense and started learning how to do some submissions and stuff and got good on the ground, the dude became the heavyweight champion. And I think when he was heavyweight champion, he had a record of like 4-7 or something, right? So you're talking about a guy who went from being almost never having a win. I think he was like one. Let me check Maurice Smith's record at some right now. I think at one point he was like 1-5, and then went on a rally and ended up winning the UFC title. Okay, so yeah, he won his first fight, then lost his second fight, won his third fight, lost, won, lost, won. Yeah, so by the time he fought for the UFC title, he was 5-7. Okay, not 4-7. Sorry. And then he won it, and then he defended it. So for a short period of time, he was the lineal heavyweight champion of the world. Arguably the best heavyweight in the world. Well, I'd say it. Winning the lineal title, taking it from the the baddest at the time, Mark Coleman. Eventually the title would leave the UFC with Randy Couture, and then come back much later with Verdum. But at one point he was the man who beat the man with a 6-7 record, right? And part of that was just the early days of the sport were much, much different, right? So had a guy like Maurice Smith, who clearly was able to compete at a high level once he figured out what to do, been able to train from youth. Like his first fight was in 93. He was born in 61, so by the time he had his first fight, he was already 32 years old. Had he grown up doing MMA like a lot of young people do nowadays, or even had he grown up wrestling, and then transitioned to MMA, he would probably have a much, much better record and might have been able to go on to win 4, 5, 6 title defenses. So I do think that a big factor in it is just accomplishments. What were you able to accomplish in your day? Because you can only compare it to your own era. But long story short, that's it for today. Like, comment, subscribe, and I'll